Bloomburrow, we get some super sweet class enchantments, an above the curve Raccoon, and a discard spell that kinda lets you Thoughtseize the top of your opponent's deck, and a bunch more. Let's break them down. Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Seth Live, and it's time for one final daily dose of Bloomburrow spoilers. So tomorrow we shift gears into Commander Precon spoilers for Bloomburrow, but today we got a bunch more main set cards to break down, and some pretty spicy ones, which means we should probably get into it, start talking sweet new Bloomburrow cards. Before we do, a couple of quick reminders. First, if you need any of these cards, you can pre-order them from our sponsor Card Kingdom over at cardkingdom.com/MTGGoldfish. Second, to keep up on all the latest previews throughout the day, you should head on over to MTGpreviews.com. Anyway, let's talk some Bloomburrow. First up today, we get a power creepy new Raccoon in Scrap Shooter. So a 3-mana 4/4 green Raccoon Archer. It has reach, and it says when it enters, if a gift was promised, and the gift in this case is a card, destroy target artifact or an enchantment an opponent controls. So Scrap Shooter seems like a very strong standard card just based on rate. Like 3-mana 4/4 is very good stats even in 2024. There's not a whole lot of green creatures that have those stats or better, so just based on its power and toughness versus its mana cost, this looks like a card that should be able to see play. It's like a bloated Contaminator or whatever, so a good card based on rate. Plus, you get this upside of the gift ability, where if your opponent happens to have a busted artifact or an enchantment, you can give them the gift of the card and get a Rexage or a Lauren out of it to blow up whatever the most important artifact or enchantment on the battlefield is. Also, reach is a relevant upside. We'll have to see what post-rotation standard looks like, but right now, the single most played creature in standard is Aclazotz. And this is a 3-drop that actually just trades with the Bat God. Plus you got like Deep Cavern Bat, Chrome Host Seed Shark. I imagine there will be flyers seeing play after rotation. So having reach, even though it might not be the most exciting keyword, is a very relevant keyword in standard. And then as I mentioned, you get the upside of blowing up a Virtue of Loyalty, a Leyline Binding, or Urbrass Forge. It's a temporary lockdown. So I think it's a relevant ability. So I think the way you think about this card is it's a 3-mana 4/4 reachy beater that some percentage of the time you use to blow up an artifact or an enchantment. It's actually very different than like Lauren or a Rexage, which are cards that you play to blow up an artifact or an enchantment, because they're 3-drops that are what, 2/1s. Their stats just aren't very good, so they're cards that you wouldn't play if it wasn't for their ability to blow up an artifact or an enchantment. This is a card that you play because its stats are so good, and then you get the bonus that sometimes you're going to blow up the artifact or an enchantment. So the question is, where does this card fit? And hilarious as it sounds, there might actually be like mono green Raccoon aggro in our current standard. You have like Valley Mistcaller into Keen-Eyed Curator into Scrap Shooter. That is a very above the curve that can put a lot of power on the battlefield. The question's going to be, does this solve green's problem of just getting absolutely hosed by cards like Sunfall? Not necessarily. So green just hasn't been good in so long. I'm not sure if this will change at rotation or not, but you can see the pieces coming together for a very strong green Raccoon aggro deck. Outside of Raccoon decks, the question is really, how does this compare to Tranquil Throwback? They're really competing for the same role, the same slot. Scrap Shooter has some upsides. It's a bigger creature, and it's a faster creature in the sense that for 3 mana, you get to blow up the artifact or enchantment right away if you need to. Tranquil Throwback also has some upsides, where it can gain you life, it can also exile a graveyard, but it's going to be more expensive because you got to pay the extra green mana for its kicker, and its stats are a little bit smaller, so it'll probably depend on the deck and on the meta, but I think these cards serve a very similar purpose, and Tranquil Throwback has actually seen a lot of play. So if we end up in a meta where being a 4/4 is pretty important compared to a 3/3, or a meta where having reach is really important, or in a meta where like Graveyard Hate just isn't that essential, I could see Scrap Shooter just being a better version of Tranquil Throwback, even though it's less flexible. Also remember, we're gonna have Foundation soon, and once Foundation drops, because we're getting Llanowar Elves back in standard, the value of green 3-drops shoots through the roof, because what you really want to do with Llanowar Elves is play it on turn 1 into a 3-drop on turn 2. That is the explosive Llanowar Elves start. So a card like Scrap Shooter, I think it's even better in November once Foundations actually releases. And then in Commander, I think this card's just very good. If you look at similar cards like Lauren or Reclamation Sage. These are some of the most heavily played creatures in their colors, and I can't see why Scrap Shooter wouldn't be the same thing. I'm not gonna say it's just better than Rec Sage, because Rec Sage is an elf, which is a more relevant creature type than Raccoon Archer, but still, this is a bigger Rec Sage, and I think you play it alongside Rec Sage or as a backup Rec Sage, or it does have some big upsides where a lot of green card draw is based on like a creature's power. This is gonna be way better with a Rishkar's expertise, let's say, than a Reclamation Sage, so this just seems like a really good card for Standard and also for Commander. We also got a new white case in Caregiver's Talent. So 3 mana for a white case. Level 1 is whenever one or more tokens you control enter, draw a card. This ability triggers only once each turn. You get to level 2 for a single mana, and that's when this class becomes level 2. Create a token that's a copy of target token you control, and then for 4 more mana, you get to level 3, which is token creatures you control get +2/+2. So Caregiver's Talent, obviously a card for token decks, but in those decks, the card seems really good. It's essentially like a Taskia's Welcome for tokens that then gives you the 3 Blind Mice's ability to copy a token, and then eventually, once you get it fully leveled up, is a Tempered Steel for tokens, like a double Anthem, so all your little 1/1 tokens are suddenly going to be really realistic threats. So I think that Caregiver's Talent gonna be very good in any token deck in Standard. Rabbits care about tokens, squirrels care about tokens. Obviously, if you're not a token deck, this isn't nearly as exciting. Also worth mentioning, its first ability, the card draw ability, is whenever one or more tokens, not creature tokens. So in theory, you can like get this on the battlefield and play a Novice Inspector and make a clue token and get a card draw from the clue coming into play or a food token coming into play. So it's nice that it triggers off anything. Also true that that second mode can copy non-creature tokens, so you could copy a food or a clue or a treasure if you wanted to. I don't think you're normally going to do that, but that is a thing that you could do. So it seems really good for any token deck in Standard, even outside of the new Bloomburrow stuff. We got Gleeful Demolition, Go Wide token decks. We have Kemble, so the pieces exist to build a really strong token deck in Standard, although I am a little nervous. Streets of New Capenna somehow is 3 years ago now, and that gave us some cards that seem so good for a token deck with Jetmir and Ginny Faye, and for the last 3 years, we've been talking about and trying to make token works, and they just have not worked in Standard. I think in large part due to just like the powerful sweepers in the format. It's really hard to just be like, I'm gonna go super wide with tokens if a lot of decks have Sunfall style effects in their deck. So we'll have to wait and see if this changes at rotation. Like, can tokens be good? That's my only concern for this card. I have zero doubt that Caregiver's Talent is a good card in tokens. The question is, are tokens gonna be a good enough archetype? I'm crossing my fingers and hoping that thanks to the new Bloomburrow stuff, it'll actually work this time, but I was also pretty high on tokens after Streets of New Capenna came out, and those ones just never really took off. Also seems cute with PNLR. There's just so many different options for playing this card. The Pia deck really good at playing stuff from Exile, making Thopter tokens. Now these Thopters are going to be drawing you cards. Eventually you level it up, and all your hasty Thopters are hitting for 3 in the air. It can also do some 3 Blind Mice shenanigans. This is more of like an against the odds thing, but it's pretty cute. So 3 Blind Mice, the trick of that is to make a token copy of it, and then when you get to the second and third counters on it, you can use it to copy itself, and you get this like huge board of 3 Blind Mice. It just keeps copying itself again and again and again. Caregiver's Talent can do the same thing with its second level. So let's say you play this for 3 mana, and then you copy it with Calyx Guided by Fate, so you get a token copy. When you level it up, you can make a token copy of the Caregiver's Talent itself, which will give you another one. So now when a token ETBs, you're going to draw 2 cards a turn, and then when you level that up for 1 mana, you can again copy the second one that's a token, and now you get 3 of them and then 4 of them. So it is a pretty cute plan. I don't know if it'll be super competitive, but it is worth mentioning, especially since level 2 is only 1 mana, that once you get this going, you can make a huge board of Caregiver's Talents really, really quickly. In Commander, token stable. It's kind of like Idol of Oblivion. Idol of Oblivion is a card that I play in pretty much every token deck because it's a 2-mana artifact that taps to draw a card, and you can only do it once a turn because it has to tap, and only if a token was created this turn. Caregiver's Talent is kind of the same effect, right? Once per turn, if you make a token, you get to draw a card. Yes, it's a white card, it's 1 more mana, but you get all these extra upsides of copying your tokens and pumping your tokens. So if you're playing literally any token deck, Gyrid, Jetmir, Bernard, Cadria, Mondrak, I'm running Caregiver's Talent, and I think it's going to be one of the better support cards in my entire deck. So Caregiver's Talent, just a really strong token card for Standard and back to Commander, plus you get some janky against the odds combos thrown in. We also got A ridiculous card, an absolutely absurd card in Cruelclaw's Heist. So Cruelclaw's Heist, 2 black mana for a sorcery. This is target opponent reveals their hand. You can choose a non-land card from it, exile that card, but you can promise your opponent a gift of a card. If a gift was promised, you can cast that card for as long as it remains exiled, and mana of any type can be spent to cast it. So Cruelclaw's Heist, on level 1, it's a distress, right? It's a 2 mana discard spell. We've seen through Magic's history that the best discard is 1 mana, but we have definitely seen playable 2 mana discard spells in the past, especially in Standard where we don't get 1 mana discard spells outside of Duress very often. The upside of Cruelclaw's Heist is if you gift a card, you essentially get a 2 mana Covetous Urge. Yes, you're giving your opponent an extra card, which is a bad thing, but you're actually stealing the card that you Thoughtseize, and you can play that with your mana being perfectly fixed for it for the rest of the game, which is incredibly strong. So I think that Cruelclaw's Heist, this card should be very exciting in Standard. Another comparison is Cruelclaw's Heist is kind of a 2024 and functioning under the rules of Modern Magic version of Word of Command. Word of Command, one of the most infamous pieces of art in Magic, just the eyes in the darkness, but it's a 2 mana instant that has an almost incomprehensible wall of text. You may look at an opponent's hand and choose any card an opponent can legally play using mana from his or her mana pool or lands. Opponent must play this card immediately, and you make all the decisions it calls for. The spell may not be countered after you've looked in an opponent's hand. So this is kind of like Word of Command, except you get to play the card using your mana at some point in the future. So I think Cruelclaw Heist is actually going to be really strong. If you think about discard spells, the gold standard is Thoughtseize, right? 1 mana, you lose some life, your opponent has to discard a non-land card. Cruelclaw Heist, it's 1 more mana, so that's the big drawback, but it has not just 1, but 2 huge upsides compared to Thoughtseize. So one is, Thoughtseize is a dead card once your opponent's empty-handed. Once your opponent has no cards in hand, you top deck your Thoughtseize, it does literally nothing. Cruelclaw's Heist, it still does something, right? Because even if your opponent's empty-handed, you can take and gift your opponent a card, and the way this will resolve is your opponent draws the card first, and then you'll look at their hand, and you can heist the card from their hand, and then if you get the mana, you can actually cast it if you want to right away. So it's really, really strong in that regard, that this is a Thoughtseize that still does something if you draw off the top of your deck in the late game. The other weird upside of this is one of the downsides to Thoughtseize that you hear Magic players say all the time is you can't Thoughtseize the top of your opponent's deck. Even if you strip all the good stuff from your opponent's hand, they're still going to draw their card the next turn, and if that's the card they need, they're going to get you in a very weird roundabout way. Cruelclaw's Heist does actually Thoughtseize the top of your opponent's deck, because again, if you give the gift, they draw the card first, so they draw the top card of their deck, and then you can Thoughtseize that card out of their hand and even steal it and play it and use it against them in the future. So I think in Standard, this card should be very, very good. The only question is 2 mana too much? And I gotta say, considering the upside of the card, the fact that you're just like straight up stealing the card and you can use it later in the game if you gift it, I feel like this card is gonna be good enough even at 2 mana. We see Duress see relatively heavy play. Duress is even seeing some main deck play in Standard. I think that Cruelclaw's Heist, assuming you can deal with the double black mana cost, should be a better option in main decks, in like Golgari or mono black especially. So I think this card will definitely see a lot of Standard play in main decks, definitely in sideboards. And also, we've talked at various times throughout spoiler season about the potential for a discard deck. This seems right at home with Bandit's Talent and Hostile Investigator, making me even more excited for seeing if we can actually make mono black discard work in Standard. In other formats, I think Commander's the other one where this might be relevant. I don't think Actually, I don't know. I don't think it can work in Modern. The upside of stealing the card is cool, but remember, you still have to spend the mana on the card. It's not like a Dothy Voidwalkers or something where you get to cast the card for free. So if you cast this and steal your opponent's Ulamog or Karn, you still need enough mana to cast it, so keep that in mind. But where I think this can work is in Commander. Traditionally, Thoughtseize-style discard effects are horrible in Commander because it only targets one person, right? So taking the best card out of a single opponent's hand just isn't that valuable. But Cruelclaw Heist, I think in Commander, I don't even think of it as a discard spell. I think of it as a theft spell. And if you're telling me there's a card I can play in my theft deck that is like, look at an opponent's hand, whoever has the most powerful deck or the most cards in their hand, and I just get to take the best non-land from their hand and then cast it in the future, that's something I would play every single time. And like Sen Triplet, Xanathar, Don Andres, Gonti, any deck that's built around stealing my opponent's cards and using it against them. So I think Wizards actually managed to build a the Thoughtseize effect, it's really good in Commander. Plus, remember in Commander, you can give the card to someone else. So you can steal the card from Crim's hand and give the card to Richard to get some political favors if you want to. So Cruelclaw Heist, I'm really high on this card. I think this card is going to be way better than people maybe realize. I just think that being able to steal the card is such an incredibly huge upside that that's going to make this more than worth playing in a lot of decks. Even though it costs 2 mana, and that's one more than you really want to cast, the upside is just so incredibly high. We also got Essence Channeler, a new white 2-drop 2/1 Bat Cleric. It says, as long as you've lost life this turn, it gets Flying and Vigilance, and then whenever you gain life, put a +1/+1 counter on it, and then when it dies, you can put all of its counters on another target creature you control. So Essence Channeler, it's essentially a Voice of the Blessed, a replacement for Voice of the Blessed. Voice is rotating out of Standard, and it has some upsides. I think in general, Voice is probably better because you don't have to lose life during your turn to give it Flying and Vigilance, but there is some upsides to Essence Channeler in that once it dies, you get to dump all the counters on something like Star Pupil style. Doesn't line up well with Wraths because you won't have any creatures to put it on, but outside of getting Wrath, it's pretty powerful that if your opponent kills your biggest creature, you just make something else your biggest creature. So this is the card from the set that I gotta say it. You know I gotta say it. It seems like it could be good in Soul Sisters, right? Like, it works perfectly with what Soul Sisters want to do. Every time you play a creature, you're gaining life with your Soul Sisters and growing your Essence Channeler, which is very similar to how Voice of the Blessed works. So we'll have to wait and see. Like, in a Soul Sister deck, Voice of the Blessed makes the cut a lot of times, even back to, like, Modern or in Timeless. Is this going to see play alongside Voice of the Blessed? I don't think it replaces Voice of the Blessed. The ability for Voice to eventually become indestructible is actually just a big upside, but it does seem like a good Soul Sisters deck. As far as Standard is concerned, I think this is mostly a bat card. So I've been thinking about this. Could we make a Soul Sisters deck work in Standard? The answer is we have a lot of pieces for it, right? Gumdrop Poisoner, Case of Uneaten Feast, Teething Wormlet, Amalia, LSL Core. So there's a lot of life gain synergies. My catch is, if these synergies were good enough, why don't we already have one of these decks with Voice of the Blessed, which kind of does exactly what Essence Channeler does? So I feel like the generic life gain deck, probably not good enough, because if it was good enough, it would have been good enough with Voice of the Blessed and not Essence Channeler. However, this is a bat, and it works really well with the bat plan, because bats, remember, are all about losing life and gaining life. So you get their Soul Sister effects and Life Creed Duel. You got stuff like Lunar Convocation, Zoraline, which are great support cards and payoff. They're giving you ways to lose life and ways to gain life. So I feel like they work really, really well together. So we'll have to wait and see just how good bats are, but I feel like this should be kind of a staple bat 2-drop. Plus, if you do want to build around other life gain synergies, this gives you a very reasonable replacement for Voice of the Blessed, which is just something that we didn't have in the past. There's also some arguments to playing this in older formats. So in older formats, I do play Voice of the Blessed in Soul Sisters. I actually got a Soul Sister video coming up in the future that I'm working on. So we are going to be playing Soul Sister soon, and Voice of the Blessed is one of the best cards in the deck. The upside of playing this card in like Timeless or in Modern is it synergizes really well with fetch lands, really well with shock lands, synergizes with the One Ring, losing your life with the burden counters. So all these cards make it really easy to lose life during your turn to give this Flying and Vigilance. Voice of the Blessed, it starts off as just a 2/2 ground creature, and you got to get 4 counters on it for it to have Flying and Vigilance. So one of the upsides of Essence Channeler is it becomes a Flying and Vigilant creature earlier in the game than a Voice of the Blessed does. The big downside of Essence Channeler is 1 toughness, and I think that's probably what just keeps this card from seeing play outside of maybe Pioneer. But in any Orcish Bowmaster format, it's just so hard to play 2-drops that have 1 toughness, that need to do things to get value. So Essence Channeler seems solid. It's like a nice Voice of Resurgence replacement. We'll have to see what it does in Standard. I think it should at least be good enough for the bat deck, and maybe some other decks too. Plus, you get the upside of some super sweet new Wily Beckert art. We also got Azure Beastbinder, a new blue 2-drop rat rogue. So it's a 2-mana 1/3 with Vigilance. It says it can't be blocked by creatures with power 2 or greater, and then when it attacks, up to 1 target artifact, creature, or planeswalker an opponent controls loses all abilities until your next turn. If it's a creature, its base power and toughness is 2/2 until your next turn. So Azure Beastbinder, very strange card. It reminds me a bit of like a War Kite Marauder, kind of like a Kite Sail Arsonist. Is a creature that can get through whatever the biggest thing on your opponent's side of the battlefield is. It's not really removal because it's temporary, but still, this is a way if your opponent has a Shieldred or whatever, you just turn it into a 2/2, you smash in with your team, get in a ton of damage. Whether this is going to be better than Kitesail Arsonist or see play alongside Kitesail Arsonist, that kind of remains to be seen. It doesn't have the biggest stats on its own. I think it's probably at its best if you can buff it. If you can buff this, it becomes very hard to interact with because only creatures with power 1 or 0 can actually block it. So if you can start growing its power, your opponent's going to have a pretty massive board of 1 power creatures to actually be able to stop this and get it off the battlefield. So it synergizes really well with like Lost Jedi, any swords, even Agatha's Soul Cauldron, anything to just grow it and kind of turn it into this almost unblockable creature. So I think that Beastbinder, it could serve a role. I'm just not exactly sure where you put it. I don't know. Rats are very weird. Out of all the tribes in Bloomburrow, rats are the most disjointed to me, where I'm not really sure what rats are trying to do. They have some good standalone cards, but I haven't seen much that really wants to make me put a ton of rats together into the same deck. So I'm not sure there's going to be a rat deck, although it is worth pointing out that Azure Beastbinder is a rat rogue, and rogue is an outlaw creature type. So maybe this is actually an outlaw card where you're using this with Double Downs and Rockish Crews and Vile Smashers. It's worth mentioning when it attacks, up to 1 target artifact creature planeswalker loses its abilities, which means every turn when this attacks, it's technically committing a crime, which is going to trigger all your crime stuff, which works well with the outlaw stuff. So that might be the role of this card, is actually additional support for like a Grixis outlaw deck, a Grixis crime deck. So that might be a more likely home than rats itself. So Azure Binder Beast, this seems fine. Like, I could see the uses in some sort of tempo deck, especially if you can take advantage of its creature types, but I don't know, it's only got 1 power, it doesn't get in that much damage, so a very hard card to evaluate. We also got a new blue class in Storm Chaser's Talent. So 1 mana to cast. When it enters, you make a 1/1 blue and red otter creature token with prowess. Level 2 costs 4 mana, and when it becomes level 2, you return an instant or sorcery card from your graveyard to your hand. Level 3 costs 6 mana. Whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, create a 1/1 blue and red otter creature token with prowess. So this card this card is very weird. So on one hand, it's a 1 mana 1/1 that can trigger prowess because it's technically a spell. So it reminds me kind of Elusive Otter, a card that's already in the format, hasn't seen much play yet. But because of its adventure mode, you can't do it all at once. But essentially, it's a 1 mana 1/1 that you could also use adventure mode to trigger prowess if you're in green. Storm Chaser's Talent is probably better than that just as a 1 mana 1/1 because you get to cast it, trigger prowess on whenever's on the battlefield, and get the 1/1. The other 2 modes, my god, are so much mana. So if you want to Flood of Recollection, get an instant or sorcery back from your graveyard to your hand, you gotta pay 4 more mana on top of the one that you already paid. And then, if you pay 6 more mana on top of the 5 that you've already paid, for a total of 11 mana, you essentially get a bad Monastery Mentor, but it only works with instants and sorceries, not other non-creature spells. And honestly, that's kind of one of my criticisms of this card, is it specifically works with instants and sorceries. So even if you spend all that mana to level it up, and you cast a future Storm Chaser's Talent, it's not even going to trigger level 3. So this isn't to say that the card is bad. If you want an Elusive Otter style effect, maybe you're playing a Is It Prowess style deck with Monastery Swipster, Slickshot Show Off, I think this card might be good enough just for the first mode. I think like 90% of games or something, you're going to play this just as a 1 mana 1/1 that's going to trigger prowess on all your other creatures, and that's what the card is for you. You're not really planning to level it up. The other levels are like, this game has gone really, really poorly. Somehow I'm playing this aggro deck and still alive on turn 8, and I got this extra mana that I'm not using, so I might as well level it up. I think that's kind of the play pattern of this card. I don't think you play it and think, I'm gonna turbo to level 3, because it's just way too much mana. You will die in most games of Magic if that is your game plan, to just like play this on 1, turn 4, level up to level 2, turn 6, level up to level 3. You're just gonna be dead at that point. But as a 1 mana 1/1 prowesser, it could still have some implications. It could be good in otters as well. We have some otter cards like Valley Floodcaller that really cares about otters on the battlefield and wants you casting non-creature spells. So I think maybe that's a home for it, is like in the otter deck alongside of the prowess deck. But as I said before, I'm a little skeptical of the other modes on this card just because they're so overcosted. Like, for 6 mana, you can get a Shark Typhoon that triggers on any non-creature spell and doesn't make a 1/1 prowess creature. It makes a creature with power and toughness equal to the mana value of the spell that you cast. So I feel like Stormchaser's talent, it serves a purpose. If your deck wants an elusive otter style effect, and you're like an Is It Prowess deck or an Otter Spellslinger deck, I think this card is actually pretty good, just as the 1 mana 1/1 that triggers your stuff. But don't get trapped into the other modes. They're just really way too expensive to be something you're going to be doing very commonly. In the world of lower rarity cards, couple worth shouting out, starting with Flamevessel Gecko. So, a 2 mana 2/2, it's a red lizard warlock. It says when it enters, if an opponent lost life this turn, add a black and a red, and then you can pay 1 and a red to discard a card and draw a card. So, Flamevessel Gecko is kind of a Burning Tree Emissary or a Hidden Herbalist, one of these 2-drops that are essentially free because of the mana they make when they enter the battlefield. The only challenge I would say with Flamevessel Gecko is you do have to make sure your opponent lost life during the turn. So like Burning Tree Emissary, you can just slam that on turn 2 no matter what, it's going to do its thing. If this is not making back its mana, it's not really a playable card. So you got to make sure that you're a deck that can actually make it free. In that deck, it can be very powerful because there's going to be games where you like play a 1-drop, hit your opponent on turn 2, you drop like 2 or 3 of these and kind of just steamroll your opponent. It does work really well with lizards. Lizards have a lot of ways to damage your opponent by turn 2, like Hired Claw. When it attacks, gonna deal a damage even if it gets blocked. Iridescent Vine Lasher, if you play it on turn 1, turn 2 you make your land drop, hit your opponent with its landfall damage, turn on Flamevessel Gecko. Even like Gev deals damage as you cast your lizards. So I think in lizards this could be really good. Not sure how good lizards are gonna be. They're one of the tribes that I'm kind of like on the fence if they're really going to be competitive, but I do think this is a very strong card. Could also maybe just see playing mono red where you play a 1-drop on turn 1, a Phoenix Chick, a Swift Spear, hit your opponent, dump your hand of Flame Vessels on turn 2. Plus remember, this is a Burning Tree Emissary with an extra ability, which is pay 2 to Rummage, which is actually pretty good. Not that you want a game plan around that, but if you're playing mono red and you happen to run out of action and you draw too many lands, being able to pay 2 and pitch a land to try to draw that burn spell or haste creature to close out the game is actually a nice upside. So I think that Flamevessel Gecko definitely going to be an interesting standard 2-drop and could maybe have some implications in older formats. Now we have this along with Burning Tree Emissary, although awkwardly they make the wrong colors of mana to fully support each other. Your Burning Tree mana can cast Flamevessel Gecko, but your Flamevessel Gecko mana can't cast Burning Tree Emissary, so maybe we can't put them all together in the same deck, but still very powerful looking uncommon. We also got Eddymurk Crab, a 7 mana 5/5 elemental crab with flash. It costs 1 less to cast for each instant or sorcery card in your graveyard. It enters tapped if it's not your turn, so if you flash it in, it's going to be tapped, and then when it enters, tap up to 2 target creatures. So Eddymurk Crab, that's kind of Tolarian Terror, and I'm not really sure which of these are better, or maybe just play them both together. So Tolarian Terror, we have seen play in standard in like the mono blue deck, where it's often a 1 mana 5/5 ward 2, thanks to having the same reduction ability that the crab has. The question's going to be, is the upside of the crab, which is you can flash it in on your opponent's turn, which any mono blue deck that's built around holding up counters is actually a very relevant upside. You don't have to choose between, do I play my terror or leave up a counter spell? With crab, you can leave up your counter spell, and if you don't need to counter, flash it into play. So is that enough upside to make it worth costing 1 more mana? And I think the answer is probably yes. I think even though it's slightly less efficient, I think being able to play at instant speed just works so well with mono blue is trying to do that I think this is probably better Tolarian Terror in standard decks at least. I will also say, you probably could just play all of them. Maybe there's a deck that's just like all counter spells and card draw, and you just play all 8 of these, and these are your finishers. We still have a lot of support for this too. We got Haughty Jin still, we got Elug, which is one of my favorite new mythics from the set that also works really well with the mono blue plan. So definitely excited and a little bit scared to see if mono blue control might actually be a thing in standard after rotation. Finally today, got a bunch of draft chaff that you can check out over on MTGpreviews.com. Anyway, that brings us to the end of our daily Bloomburrow spoilers for today, and I think for for the main set all together. Tomorrow, we get all the Commander precons, so make sure to head over to the MTG Goldfish Commander channel. I'm going to be covering all the Commander precons then, but let me know what you think about all these cards. Which card from today are you most excited for? Let me know what you think in the comments. Thanks for watching, everyone. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will talk to you soon. Looking for even more Magic? Well, make sure to check out yesterday's spoiler video here, or maybe the video where we talked about the plays that actually changed the rules of the game of Magic.